Okay, welcome to what is unfortunately the very final lecture for Between War and Peace. I hope that you aren't in tears at home. It's been wonderful teaching you. Hope today's lecture you enjoy. Okay, today I'm going to present an overview of what we've been looking at, drawing out some key themes, highlighting the key issues for each of the various issues that we've explored every week. I'm also going to say something in a bit more detail than we did in the seminars about what exactly I'm looking for in the exams and the essays. I'll start then by providing an overview of what we've been looking at, highlighting some of the key questions, key issues for each of the topics. Remember that we started with two major theories. The first was the responsibility to protect, the R2P. This encompasses all of the various options that we've been looking at. We focused particularly on questions around mass atrocities with many of the responses, although we've also looked at questions of aggression that aren't quite part of R2P. R2P, remember, concerns four sorts of mass atrocities: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. Key claim of R2P: standing by is not an option. The international community has a duty, responsibility to step in to tackle mass atrocities in the case of these four crimes. Now, remember when we looked at the R2P, various different models of it, the main one to focus on is the three-pillar approach. Pillar one concerns the protection responsibility to the states. Pillar two concerns international assistance, and pillar three is where coercive action lies, timely and decisive response. So when thinking about sanctions, intervention, several of the other measures that we've looked at, though many of those would be pillar three measures. Some might be pillar two when the state consents to them, but many of them will be pillar three when the state doesn't agree to them. Why does R2P matter? Well, it's the main language that's used to frame the discussions around responding to serious, major violations of basic human rights, to respond to genocide. You find that academics, public debate, they don't use the language of humanitarian intervention to such a degree anymore. It's in terms of R2P. R2P, though, to reiterate, is much broader than humanitarian intervention. And one thing that we've been doing in this module is to show that, which is to show that R2P concerns all of the various alternatives that we've been looking at, not just military intervention, which is sometimes found in the rhetoric around R2P. It involves sanctions, diplomacy, non-violent resistance, incentives, criminal prosecutions. Two main issues, challenges for R2P. Firstly, does it really make a difference? So there's a debate in the literature about whether the norm of R2P has actually changed anything in international politics, or whether it's just hot air, empty rhetoric, doesn't alter much. The other key issue is whether, despite what I've just said, whether it's still really predominantly about military intervention and regime change. And this was one of the debates in the case of the intervention in Libya in 2011, where the intervention ended up involving regime change. So to reiterate, R2P provides the framework within which we've analysed lots of the alternatives. Then we went on to war, just war theory. Remember, just war theory, two major categories that we've been concerned with. Jus ad bellum, which concerns before war, at the time the decision is going to be made to resort to war, is war justified? Various principles of just war, just cause, right intention, last resort, proportionality, formal declaration of war, legitimate authority. We examined these in the seminars in particular, where we explored which ones are more important than others. Jus in bello conditions. These concern during war, how we should actually justifiably wage war. These concern principles of non-combatant immunity and the moral equality of soldiers. One point to highlight in particular here is last resort for principles of jus ad bellum. We spent a bit more time focusing on this criterion given its relevance for the module. we explored how we should understand last resort, such as whether we should see it as understand it literally. So war is literally the last resort once you've done everything else. Whether we should view last resort as requiring a good attempt to pursue the alternatives, but war can still be, and war should still be predominantly viewed as last resort, or whether we should just interpret last resort as the least awful option, as suggested by Caney, on which case Eamon Oloyu argues that there's not really anything last about last resort, and it's just requiring you to weigh up all of the various alternatives. Now, just war theory, the reason why we looked at this is because it provides a very useful conceptual framework for thinking about the various options that we looked at in this module. And we have been and can apply some of the notions from just war theory to many of the other options, alternatives. So proportionality, this is one that's come up an awful lot, although we haven't always called it proportionality. This is essentially a question of whether the measure that we're looking at will be effective at promoting basic human rights. So we've been asking this question of almost all the options. Does non-violence work? Does it work in the face of a non-ruthless aggressor? Are sanctions effective? Will incentives actually address this situation? All these can be framed as a matter of proportionality. Just cause. Is there just cause for the measure? Is there just cause, for instance, for cyber war? Or is there just cause sufficient for economic sanctions? Have states done enough wrong to merit this? Right intention. Do those using the measure do so with a good enough reason to do so? Right intention. This is applied to sanctions. One of the objections here, remember, is that intentions are problematic, intending the harm objection, as we called it. It also applies potentially in favor of civilian peacekeeping. Remember here, the suggestion was that civilian peacekeepers have a good motive for conducting their operation, so should be favored. To flag up one more, legitimate authority. Do those undertaking the measure have sufficient authority to do so? This often requires UN Security Council authorization. This relevant for economic sanctions, also relevant for thinking about cyber war, and potentially many of the other options that we've been looking at, where you think it's important that those that use the measure do so, have the legitimacy to be able to do so. That's jus ad bellum. The same is true for jus in bello. These terms that we've looked at in the second lecture have been relevant for lots of the other alternatives. Key here is the move in recent debates in just war theory towards revisionism, revisionist just war theory. If you can't remember what that is, this is the notion coming from people such as Jeff McMahon that we should move away from the principle of discrimination, non-combatant immunity, moral equality of soldiers, not to take these at face value, but to think about whether soldiers participating in the war act rightly in doing so. And if they act rightly, they're not liable. And whether, on the other hand, whether civilians are liable to potentially force if they're acting wrongly. So this focus on individual liability is implicit in many of the options that we've been looking at. Criminal prosecutions focus on those who have done wrong, even if they're not technically a soldier. The same is true of targeted sanctions, focused very much on those who are liable. They don't focus on whether they're soldiers or civilians, they focus on whether the individuals in question are behaving morally problematically. The focus there, like revisionism, is on individual liability. We saw one of the issues with comprehensive sanctions is that it imposes costs on civilians who haven't potentially done anything wrong. Now, for revisionists, there's nothing morally special about war. It's just the application of moral norms governing individual self-defense. You think the laws of self-defense, the normal on a one-to-one basis. So if you're walking down the street and you get attacked, what can you do? They think we can apply these rules to warfare. We can make this analogy and apply them to warfare. War doesn't need its own special rules, sometimes called sui generis rules. What does this mean for this module? On this account, some of the principles of just war theory can be applied to the alternatives. The alternatives, if we adopt this revisionist view where there's nothing special about war, then there's no reason why we shouldn't restrict the principles that we looked at with war to the alternatives. By contrast, the traditionalists, so Michael Walzer is the most famous traditionalist, they argue that warfare is more special. When we enter into the war domain, there are different moral rules. There's something particularly wrong about war that requires particular rules. It's not just on a different scale. It's not just the fact it's more horrific. It's quantitatively different. It's a different sort of phenomenon. It's extremely horrific, if you like. Now, if you adopt this traditionalist view, then you can't easily apply many of the just war notions to the alternatives because war is a special set of, its own special set of criteria. Now, implicitly in this module, we've been more favorable towards the revisionist view in the sense that we have used some of the criteria from just war theory to analyze some of the alternatives. And the key point I want to get across is that it does seem plausible that we can use some of these notions to help frame our points and arguments. So for those of you that are more confident in your political philosophy, then you might think about using some of the revisionist just war theory arguments to help understand the alternatives. But to be clear, you don't have to, and there's many ways of doing the module well without doing so. But if you're interested, this is something you could pursue further potentially. Okay, then on to the alternatives themselves. In week 3, we examined economic sanctions. Key questions here, comparing sanctions to war. How do sanctions compare to war? Are they more justifiable, more problematic? Second key issue, intrinsic objections that we looked at, the non-instrumental ones. How serious are those? Do they preclude the case for economic sanctions? What are these key issues then, intrinsic ones? Liability objection. Remember, sanctions are impermissible because they harm the innocent. Intending the harm objection. Sanctions intentionally harm innocents so that the suffering will persuade the target state to change its policy. Instrumentalization objection. Remember here, the claim is that sanctions involve the instrumental use of the suffering of innocent civilians to achieve the greater good. Those are the intrinsic ones. There's also the ineffectiveness objection. This is a more empirical one, if you like. Simply says that sanctions don't work. Many reasons why you think sanctions might not work. One of the ones we focused on in particular is the rally round the flag effect. This is the notion that when states are under sanction regimes, the public will actually rally round the government, supporting it, rather than putting pressure on their government, because they feel that it's an insult to them, it's an abrogation of their rights to have these sanctions imposed upon them from abroad. Arms embargoes. Now, arms embargoes, there isn't an essay or an exam question on these, but you can focus in particular on them and view them as a form of economic sanctions. Arms embargoes, then, instrumental reason for them. The claim here is that we should pursue arms embargoes to reduce the means by which combatants can inflict intended and unintended harms on innocent civilians. In other words, it reduces the amount of guns around to kill innocent civilians. If you're stopping guns from coming in, makes it much harder for the conflict to go on and be quite as brutal. It might not stop it completely, but it will stop it somewhat. Intrinsic reason for arms embargoes. It stops your state being complicit in the wrongdoing of others. A few of you have highlighted relevance and complicity for other areas as well. So complicity, important notion for this module. States should propose and maintain an arms embargo, the argument goes, regardless of the consequences, because of they should avoid being complicit. Key objection to arms embargoes: they're counterproductive. As we saw in the lecture, this depends on how we understand effectiveness. If effectiveness is concerned with achieving policy change, then it does seem like they're often going to be unsuccessful. Arms embargoes are unlikely to do much on their own to stop a government repressing its population, to end the civil war, for instance. But if we see effectiveness as being measured instead on how intense the fighting is, then it might be more effective. So this notion of effectiveness and how we're understanding it is actually relevant for lots of the other options that we've been looking at in the module. So for instance, when we looked at non-violence, some of the non-violent measures might not be fully effective, might not completely stop the government's repression, but they might reduce it somewhat. You might think we should view those still as effective compared to doing nothing. Although they're not fully effective, they're not going to fully address the situation. And in fact, a lot of the options that we looked at, very few of them will fully address the situation. It's very hard to fully stop a government repressing its citizens. The next government might come in and repress its citizens. In week 4, we examined diplomacy. Key issues here: how should we compare and understand the case for diplomacy, for naming and shaming over other more traditional forms of diplomacy, such as mediation and negotiation? In other words, how important is it that states engage in what's called megaphone diplomacy, so engage really loudly, criticize others vehemently, compared to more, what's often seen as more diplomatic action, so quiet diplomacy, going through back channels, mediation, negotiation? That's one issue. Second issue: is it wrong if a state's criticism, diplomatic criticism, is hypocritical? And if so, how wrong is it? Does it preclude states from being able to permissibly engage in any diplomatic criticism of others when they are being hypocritical? And in doing so, what exactly does it mean to be hypocritical? How should we understand that? How should we understand the scope of this objection? Those are the key questions, the key issues here. Constructivism, remember, constructivism. This says that states are concerned not simply with the logic of consequences, i.e. the consequences of their actions, but also the logic of appropriateness. So what is deemed to be appropriate in the international system? In other words, they're concerned with their reputations and with legitimacy. Second key issue: contribution to global norms. How does the measure in question contribute to global norms? This is something we've considered for lots of the other options throughout the module. For naming and shaming, the argument is that naming and shaming is important to maintain global norms on R2P and against aggression. You need to name and shame those that violate these norms, otherwise they won't be properly upheld. Thirdly, the hypocrisy objection, as already mentioned. How is it morally problematic if a state's diplomatic criticism is hypocritical? How should we understand this objection? How serious is it? What's its scope? Week 5, nonviolent resistance. Key issues here: does nonviolence work? Is it futile, even counterproductive, in particular in the face of a ruthless opponent? When exactly should it be used? When is it a suitable measure? And which measures in particular? So you might want to distinguish carefully here between civilian peacekeeping, that we looked at in quite a bit more detail, and other forms of nonviolence, such as civilian defense. Key issues, key notions, concepts here. Political jiu-jitsu. This is the idea, roughly put, that if you use nonviolence, you're more likely to get much more support internationally. Civilian defense. The key objection to this is the ruthless opponent objection. It won't work against the ruthless opponent, or it won't work against a state that is not engaged in occupation. Civilian peacekeeping. At the moment, remember, it's on a pretty small scale. Key civilian peacekeeping organizations are PBI, Peace Brigades International, Nonviolent Peace Force. Have a look at those websites, the websites of these organizations, to get a bit more up-to-date information on what they're actually engaged in. Key objection, limited use objection. This is the claim that civilian peacekeeping can't achieve much and very difficult to upscale. Remember that the focus for this week is on external nonviolence. So we're not thinking about nonviolence as a means of reacting internally to our government's repression. It's a means of reacting to either external aggression, another state trying to invade you, as in the case of civilian defense, or using nonviolence abroad, in the case of civilian peacekeeping, to try to deal with human rights abuses beyond your state. Pacifism. The relationship between nonviolence and pacifism. One can be a pacifist. If one endorses pacifism, it's almost the case that all pacifists will endorse nonviolence. However, people can endorse nonviolence without necessarily being a pacifist. As we saw in the lecture, one particular interesting notion is that of strategic nonviolence, which is that we should endorse nonviolence because it works. This links to the soft and hard rejection, to some degree, of pacifism. On the soft view of pacifism, soft rejection of war and pacifism, war is generally something we should try to avoid. On the hard rejection of pacifism, war is always wrong. Now, if you remember, we looked at the consequentialist or instrumental objections to war and the deontological intrinsic ones. Consequentialism one is pretty straightforward. It just says that war creates so many harms, so much horror that we should avoid it. Consequences of war are always bad. The deontological one invokes, if you remember, what was called the doctrine of doing and allowing. It says that other things being equal, doing harm is worse than allowing it. So what this means is that we should avoid war because you will be involved in doing harm, harming others with your own agency. You will engage in bombing campaigns, for instance. And it's wrong to do that regardless of the consequences. Even if the war might bring about even better consequences than not going to war, you should avoid doing harm. So that's pacifism on the soft and hard rejection of war. The hard rejection of war you particularly find associated with these deontological objections. But just to reiterate, one can endorse nonviolence without being a pacifist. One can be a strategic, believe that strategic nonviolence is, the strategic justification for nonviolence is plausible, and still endorse war occasionally when nonviolence doesn't work. Okay, week 6, positive incentives. Key issues here: how they compare to coercive measures, how and why they are better. So how do they compare in particular to sanctions? So sanctions involve lots of coercion, incentives involve no coercion. That's on the face of it. Rewarding aggression. Is it problematic that they reward wrongdoing? For instance, is it problematic that they reward evil, that they might lead to moral hazard, that they might lead to corruption? Key arguments in favor of incentives. Firstly, they're not coercive, non-coercive advantage. This is linked to the doing and allowing distinction. Incentives don't tend to harm. They're not like many of the other options that involve doing harm. There's no typically harm involved because there's no coercion involved. That's not always the case, but typically the case. Key intrinsic objection, the rewarding evil objection. This is the notion, recall, that incentives reward wrongdoers such as potentially Assad if you will offer Assad an incentive to step down. Gives them a benefit they don't deserve. How much do you think this matters? Other instrumental worries include the crowding out objection, corruption objection, the moral hazard objection. Week 7, international criminal justice. Key questions here: peace versus justice. Does the International Criminal Court undermine the achievement of human rights? Is it counterproductive? Second key question: should we see it as a way of helping to fulfill the R2P, or should we not view it as related to the R2P? The one point to highlight about this week is that although at the start of the lecture, I ran through lots of different forms of international criminal justice, we focused on the ICC in particular. So that's what your focus should be on if you're thinking about revising this, for instance, for the exam. The case for the ICC, deterrence. This has two major elements. Positive complementarity. Remember, this is the notion that you can prompt otherwise reluctant or incapable legal institutions into launching their own prosecutions by the threat of an ICC action. Second major element, unintended positive complementarity. This is the notion that states under investigation by the ICC tried 3 times as many state officials for human rights abuses. So they feel under pressure when the eyes of the world are watching, so they get into action. Other key arguments for the ICC: intrinsic or retributivist, to put it more technically, retributivist. This is the idea that we should punish those who are involved in serious crimes, the sorts of crimes that the Rome Statute prohibits, in order simply because they deserve it. Those involved deserve it. They've done something really wrong and they deserve to go to prison. Another argument is expressivist. Prosecutions can, the argument goes, help to establish international norms against the crimes. And this relates back to week 4 when we looked at diplomacy and the case for naming and shaming to maintain the international norms on, say, R2P. Very similar argument here. We need to prosecute in order to show that these sorts of crimes are wrong and maintain the norms against them. Key objections. One is that the ICC exacerbates crises. It's counterproductive. It means that those involved in conflict won't pursue peace because they've under threat. If they do, they'll be subject to the ICC prosecution. So they might as well continue fighting. Another key issue is how politicized is the ICC? As we saw, one of the allegations is it's focused too much on Africa and focused too much on rebels compared to states. How serious are those? Are those fair criticisms? And if so, how serious are they? Week 8, cyber. Key questions here. Is a cyber attack sufficiently serious to merit going to war? Does it provide just cause for war, or just cause for other coercive responses that we've been looking at, such as sanctions? Another key issue, is it war? Should we understand cyber and cyber attack as a form of war? So when 2 states conflict with each other, trade various sort of forms of cyber attack, are they involved in a cyber war? Third key question, can just war theory cover cyber war? This depends on 2 major issues. One, your views on cyber. So whether cyber war is war, the cyber conflict is a war. So it relates to the previous question. And secondly, it relates to your view on just war theory. Remember, week 2, debate between revisionists and traditionalists. Revisionists say you can apply the concepts of just war theory quite more straightforwardly. So on the revisionist view, even if it's not war, cyber war is not war, you could still more readily apply the concepts. On traditionalist view, it might be more difficult to apply these concepts because war is a special domain, it's sui generis. And in this view, cyber war might need to be war, might need to be understood as war in order to apply the notions of just war theory. Some propose their own theory of cyber ethics to cover cyber conflicts. Should we use this rather than just war theory? Fourth major issue, is hacking back permissible? So it's the most offensive form of cyber measures. Are these okay for states to use? Key issues here, the threshold problem. Remember, this is the claim that cyber war is not sufficiently serious to cross the threshold for just cause. Attribution problem. This is to claim that it can be very difficult to determine who's responsible for the attack. Offensive-defensive distinction. This is a key conceptual point. This turns on whether the cyber measures are used beyond your own network or not. If it's beyond your own network, then it's offensive. If it's within your own network, it's defensive. Just as with military force, if it's beyond your state, it's offensive. If it's within your state's borders, if you're just fending off an attack, it's defensive. Okay. Week 9. COVID-19 and the post-liberal order. Key questions here. How does the potential move towards the post-liberal order, potential decline of the West, potentially exacerbated by COVID, affect the case for the warfare and the alternatives? Second key issue that we looked at. How should states prioritize between the various global responsibilities that they have in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? On the first question, key issues are here. Firstly, how should we understand the potential post-liberal order? What form will the post-liberal order take? Will it be, as some realists say, highly conflictual? Will it be pluralist and something that we should welcome, as other scholars such as Acharya suggest? Or will the liberal order continue on, as others such as Jitney and Ickenberry suggest? Second key issue, will the COVID-19 pandemic accelerate any move to a post-liberal order? Or will things pretty much stay the same, as Daniel Dresner suggests? Third key issue for this first question. How would the post-liberal order, if it's accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, or even if it's not, how will this affect norms such as R2P and many of the alternatives that we've been looking at? Will it, for instance, reduce significantly the influence of international norms, meaning that measures such as naming and shaming won't work as much? Or will such measures still continue to work if we're in, for instance, a much more positive, a much more less pessimistic view of the post-liberal order, where international norms still hold much more sway? On the second issue, how should states prioritize between the various responsibilities? Key concept here is opportunity costs. And if you recall, the opportunity cost objection says that wars are unjustified because of the opportunity costs. Remember, opportunity costs are the resources that you could spend elsewhere if you don't do that thing. So the argument for war is that wars are unjustified because states could pursue the resources, use the resources they spend on war elsewhere. They could tackle global poverty, tackle global disease, for instance. The numbers, it's argued, suggest, in terms of global health, that states shouldn't go to war, at least in principle, because they should use the resources instead to tackle global disease. So it might seem then that given the fewer resources that are likely to follow from the post-COVID-19 pandemic, that it's even, the opportunity costs of war are even more exacerbated. It's even more problematic than it was, say, 5 years ago to go to war, because the opportunity costs are even greater. There's far fewer resources, and to go around and spending money on war might seem wasteful. That's the argument. That's one issue. Second key issue for this question, how should we decide between responsibilities? So how are we going to weigh up responsibilities to address mass atrocities versus responsibilities to tackle climate change, responsibilities to deal with aggression, to tackle terrorism, so on and so forth? How should states decide between these? One potential way that we looked at was the notion of QALYs. Is the idea that you should focus on potential live years lost. So you should try to maximize the number of quality adjusted life years. In other words, more simply, you should save the most lives, or save the most numbers of lives, save the most lives, good quality life years, more precisely. This is a pretty utilitarian way of understanding the question, but there might be lots of other factors as well. Such as, for instance, whether we should view civil and political rights as something really important to take into account how much weight should we give to the fact that tackling mass atrocities, for instance, or engaging in economic sanctions against a repressive regime will promote citizens' civil and political rights, free them from persecution, free them from oppression, stop them from being tormented and living under significant fear from their government, of their government. Is this more important than potentially saving a greater number of lives from the threat of disease or health, or global poverty? Those are the main topics that we've covered. One thing I want to highlight now is the relationship between the measures. In most of the seminars and most of the lectures, we focused on the options in isolation. And we did this to try to get a better idea of the argument for and against them, to help understand them. But I mentioned this a couple of times in the seminars. They're often undertaken together. They're often undertaken in conjunction. And let me say a little bit more about this and how we might understand this. Sometimes the measures might work best when partnered. That is, work best when combined. Obvious examples here are sanctions, targeted sanctions, and naming and shaming. So you might want to add targeted sanctions to naming and shaming to show that you really do disapprove of the behavior in question. Or it might be that a carrot and stick approach works. So you might want to partner in positive incentives with targeted sanctions, a throffer in other words. Secondly, the measures should not necessarily be deployed sequentially from non-coercive to most coercive. On occasion, you might think that highly coercive options such as economic sanctions or war and military intervention might be more justifiable first, early on, before other measures have tried. Thirdly, some measures block other measures. So what I mean by that is some measures make it more difficult then to pursue other options. Perhaps the most obvious example here is the cutting or downgrading of diplomatic ties. This can make it much more difficult to engage in other forms of diplomacy, such as mediation or dialogue. And it can also make it much more difficult to offer positive incentives that we looked at in week 6. If you haven't got your ambassadors or consulates, it's going to be much more difficult for you to be able to understand what's going on in the state in question, and then to be able to offer, say, an incentive to them, because you won't have the context to be able to do so. There's also what we might call indirect blocking. This means that some measures can be problematic because they become the focus of international efforts and use up a lot of the resources, but they don't actually do much. It removes the political will to do more. So for instance, if you spend all of your time pursuing the case for war or military intervention, all of your diplomatic, political resources go into that, campaigning for it, it might well preclude using those same resources to pursue other options, such as incentives or criminal prosecutions or sanctions. Like that's the point. Some measures can block other measures. There's also the converse of this, which is some measures can enable others. So the launching of one measure can increase the willingness of the international community to support another. This probably works best with less coercive measures first. So if you engage in a less coercive measure, non-coercive measure, even potentially, and show that it doesn't work, then it can show that you should be upping the ante, engaging in a more coercive one. To put that more concretely, you might engage in diplomacy first. This might need to be tried politically before various international actors would go along with your state and support measures that are more coercive, such as, say, targeted economic sanctions. They won't support it unless you've first done the purely non-coercive thing. In that sense, the non-coercive measure can enable the coercive one. Another form of enabling is particular to incentives and sanctions. We saw that when we looked at incentives and when we looked at sanctions, the lifting of economic sanctions can be seen as a form of incentive. And conversely, the lifting of incentives can be seen as a form of sanctions. So if you're giving humanitarian aid, giving assistance, giving financial or political recognition, you can always threaten to withdraw that. And that withdrawal can be seen as a sanction and further leverage that you can have over a state. Okay, that summarizes the various measures that we've been looking at, the main content of the module. In part 2, I'm going to focus in particular on essay and exam advice for the module.